Evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody. My name is Bert Dicht. I am the Vice President of Membership for the National Space Society. And on behalf of Larry Ahern, Vice President of Chapters, I really would like to welcome you to our Space Forum this evening. We had a few technical difficulties, so I am not going to be doing my typical introduction. And we're actually going to go right into our presentation this evening. So make sure everything is still working. So what I'd like to do now is introduce our guest speaker. And she is a longtime member of the National Space Society and is actually on our board of advisors. But she comes with a lot of experience working at NASA. She actually has a background in physics, and as she was studying for an advanced degree at Rice University, it led to a position at the NASA Johnson Space Center, where she became one of the first shuttle flight controllers, female shuttle flight controllers. And her actual title was Flight Activities Officer. So she's going to be talking about some of those experiences that are part of her book on shuttle mission control. And also what she brings is that experience as a writer, a space historian, and now what she does, she's an advocate for STEM education. So we're going to hear a lot of that tonight, and we're looking forward to it. So Marianne, I'm just going to turn it right over to you, and we can get right into it.
Well, thank you for that great introduction, Bert. And it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you National Space Society members. And if you're not a member, I hope you'll join after this talk tonight. National Space Society has really meant a lot to me throughout my career. And I will show you some of the connections I've made through National Space Society as we go along. So tonight I'm going to be focusing on shuttle mission control and share with you some flight controller stories. We'll begin with how I actually ended up there, because I know some of you were curious about that. Well, I was inspired by the Apollo program, which was going on when I was in middle school. And in 1968, the Apollo 8 crew sent back this iconic photo of the Earth as seen from orbit around the moon. And I thought it was a message just for me. And I was determined at that point in time that I was going to go into space and be part of humans going into space. That there weren't any women astronauts back then. And so I wrote in my diary, well, I'm a girl and I know there aren't any women astronauts, but I'll just have to work harder. And I knew that there would be women astronauts eventually, because I was watching Star Trek and there was Nichelle Nichols, and she was on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise. And I thought, ooh, communications officer, that would be a great job. I'd like that. And I'd also was reading science fiction, and Robert Heinlein was my favorite author. And I especially liked the book Starman Jones, because Starman Jones was an orphan and he wanted to be an astrogator, and they wouldn't let him into the Astrogator Guild because he needed a parent to sponsor him. And so he did something unusual. I think he memorized the Astrogator books that his uncle had, and then he took a job as a cook on the Starship. And so when the Astrogator got in trouble and they needed help, they said, is there anybody who can take this job? And he said, well, I've learned all about astrogation and I can do it. And he stepped up and saved the day. So I thought maybe that would be a good model for me, that even though they wouldn't let me in because I was a woman right now, someday there might be an opportunity if I had prepared myself to take advantage of it. So I decided to study hard and in school and get myself prepared. And one of the first things I did was study everything I could find about the Apollo program. I built models and I read magazine articles and so on. And then I wrote my first book. So I've been a writer all along, and it was called, like that catchy title, The Apollo Program. I still have that book. Where did I put it here somewhere? Oh, well, I can't. Oh, there it is. I still have this book, my very first book. And I had gone to the library. We didn't have an internet back then. And I Xeroxed copies of the spacecraft, and I learned all the labels and the titles and everything. So I was ready when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon in the summer of 1969. And I ran outside with all of the other girls at summer camp, and I pointed up to the moon and I said, I can tell you where they are. I know where Tranquility is. I was so excited. And we watched them walk on the moon on the little black and white TV in the camp counselor's house. And I thought, someday I'd really like to go to the moon. And I could have never imagined that someday I would be co-authoring a book about them landing on the moon with Buzz Aldrin. But that came about through the National Space Society. I got to know Buzz. And so that's the book there down in the corner you see. It's a pop-up book, which is really a lot of fun. I always wanted to do a pop-up book, and so we got to do the pop-up book, and it has the Saturn V pops up at you, and also has little pullouts of his daughter Jan, her remembrances from that time. She was about 10 at the time he went to the moon, so that helps to personalize the story from the child's perspective. And it comes with a little lunar module in the back that you can then put together and play with. So I guess you can tell I'm still a kid at heart. So I had loaded up my brain with as much information as I could find about the space program, and I wanted to go and get a degree in science. But as I found out, it's very expensive to go to college, and money is the biggest barrier to getting a STEM degree. And it certainly was for me. My parents had divorced when I was 11, and I had two older brothers who needed help with college. And I also had a baby sister who was born when I was 14. And so I wasn't going to be deterred, though. I got jobs and worked after school, and I worked every summer when I lived with my mother in the summers. And that's a picture of me at Carowinds Amusement Park in North Carolina. I got to wear this great costume to work every day. And I saved up my money. It wasn't enough, but I saved up my money, and then with the help from my father and my stepfather, I was able to cobble together enough money to go my freshman year at Ohio University. But if I were faced with money issues today, I would be looking into intern programs and being a co-op student with NASA or with one of the NASA contractors. And you can find out more about that using this link here, intern.nasa.gov. So I got to Ohio University and I signed up for my first astronomy class. There weren't any majors in astrogation yet, but there was an astronomy course. And so I got to see Comet Kohoutek through the telescope there at Ohio University. And I was really excited about it. And I knew I'd made the right choice going into research about the stars in space. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough money to make it a second year at Ohio University. They required students to live on campus. That's a picture of me on the campus there. And so I decided to transfer to the University of North Carolina, and I was going to live with my mother and my stepfather, but they wouldn't take a transfer student at the main campus. I was able to get in at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, however, so that's where I transferred to, and it was much less expensive because I could live in an apartment, and a very cheap, horrible apartment, but hey, you do what you have to do. So, and I got a job, and I worked 20 hours a week in a grocery store so that I could stay in school. And but my astronomy professor at Ohio University had told me that if I wanted to be an astronomer, I needed to change my major from math to physics. So I did. And I had never taken a physics course, and I'm signed up to be a physics major. So you can see from my transcript here that didn't go so well at first. I got my first physics course, mechanics, heat and sound, and I only got a C. And so the head of the department pulled me in and he says, if you want to be a physics major, a C is just not going to cut it. And I said, what, I want to go work for NASA. And he said, well, let's see what we can do. And so he suggested that I join the local astronomy club. and get some hands-on experience. And so I joined the club, and we did observing, and I built a telescope. And he also got me a job analyzing physics data, and that helped also with my financial issues. And working in labs and dealing with real world astronomy brought my grades up to a B the next semester, and then I got an A in astrophysics the next semester after that. And by my junior year, I got all A's. So that hands-on experience really made a difference to me. And I encourage everyone to go out and do something practical with what you're learning. Do experiments. Not everyone learns the same way just by reading a book. And so I always include hands-on activities in my children's books for that reason. I know it helped me a lot. So I got my degree in physics, and I graduated cum laude. And that summer, I got an internship with my congressman. And his name was Ralph Regula. He was on the appropriations committee. So I followed all the appropriations process. And I also went and saw the NASA administrator go through his hearings and get approved. That was James Fletcher back then. And I went to the hearings on energy. And I came across in my studies at the Library of Congress, these articles in Physics Today about colonies in space and solar power satellites. I thought, wow, that's really cool. I'd like to know more about that. And so I was carrying around this issue, or somehow in one of the hearings, a young man came up to me and said, if you're interested in colonies in space and solar power satellites and such, you really need to join the L5 Society. And so he told me what it was, and that's now the National Space Society. So I joined in 1977 while I was that summer intern, and I haven't been sorry. I have to say, I found a whole bunch of like-minded people that were interested in these sorts of topics and made lots of friends. And then I applied for graduate school, and I chose Rice University because it's in Houston. And of course, Mission Control was in Houston, and that's where I had my eye on going to work. So I got there, and I did get to work on the solar power research program with Dr. Freeman. And it was very exciting. And I really loved it there, except that I discovered that I had a lot of holes in my background. There were prerequisites courses, because I'd had to work 20 hours a week at the grocery store, and I had taken only the minimal courses I needed to graduate. So when I got to Rice, they said, what, you didn't have quantum mechanics? What about electrodynamics at this level? And what about this math course you didn't take, complex variables? And so I ended up taking all these undergraduate senior level courses in addition to the very challenging first year graduate courses in astrophysics and mechanics and statistical mechanics, etc. And so I was really overwhelmed. And I'd also met my husband to be. We had gotten engaged, and I had realized that it was going to take me about 6 years to get my PhD. And so I started wondering, did I really need that PhD? Well, that summer, 1978, was when NASA hired the first women astronauts. And you see them all here. And I got to know all of them and work with some of them closer than others. But the first one I met was Sally Ride. They had a reception at Rice for her when she first arrived. And I went to the party, and I got to talk to her, and there were some NASA folks there. And I mentioned that I couldn't wait to go and work for NASA. And they said, well, why didn't you apply? And I said, well, I don't have my PhD yet. And all these women had PhDs or MDs. And so I assumed I had to. And they said, well, you don't have to have a PhD, to work for NASA. We've got jobs in flight control, for instance, with only need a bachelor's degree. I said, really? I had no idea. And so they said, send in an application. So I did. And then I was interviewed, and I was told that they weren't going to have an opening probably until 2 people retired, before they hired everyone. This happens a lot in government. So basically it was a hiring freeze. So I took a job with a contractor for 5 months, and I worked with Computer Science Corporation, and honed my programming skills. And then I switched over to NASA as soon as they had an opening in January of 1979. So I arrived at NASA to train for a position in mission control. And this is a diagram of what mission control looked like at the time. There were 2 mission control rooms, one on the 2nd floor and one on the 3rd floor, and they were identical. And there were about 20 primary positions. And the first row was called the trench. That's where my husband went to work. And these were in the building we call Building 30. And that's here. Can you see? I don't know if you can see my cursor. I think you can see that cursor here. The red arrow is pointing to the original part of Building 30. And notice that there are no windows. And this part of the building is where the 2 mission control rooms were located. And this part of the building, the 5-story addition, was not added until 1995 after I had left NASA. And it's named the Christopher C. Kraft Mission Control Center after the first flight director. Anyway, the 3rd floor room was the one that they had used for the Apollo 11 moon landing, and it was designated as a National Historic Monument. And in 2019, they converted it back to the way it looked at the time, complete with the ashtrays. And this is a picture down here of what it looks like now as the historic mission control. And actually it looked just like that when I arrived. And the 2nd floor looked just like that too, except for what was on the screens in the front. But the 2nd floor was gutted in the early 2000s and converted into the modern mission control room, which is now used for the International Space Station. And you see they took out the tiers, so it's all on one level now, and put in new consoles, and they even moved all the mission patches and everything. So the room that we did the first 4 space shuttle flights in no longer exists in the way that we knew it. I mean, the room is there, but it's completely changed. But this is what it looked like. The 2nd floor room looked like when I arrived, and that's me over there under the arrow. This picture was taken at the landing of the 4th shuttle flight, which landed on the 4th of July, which is why there's those flags there. And this was my position here was flight activities officer. I sat next to the Capcoms. This is Roy Bridges and Brewster Shaw. And these are 4 of the flight directors, and then the managers were in the back row. This is Gene Krantz, and there's Christopher Kraft, who the building is now named after. So mission control, wherever it is and whatever kind of consoles they're using, and there are mission control centers in Russia, for instance. There's payload control centers in Alabama, and around the world they have control centers, and of course the planetary missions are controlled in out of JPL in California. But the mission control that we think of as the mission control, whatever, for the space shuttle program was a team that identifies, prevents, and solves problems to keep the crew safe and achieve mission objectives. So that was our job, and we had about 20 of those positions in the primary room to do that, and each one of those people was supported by more flight controllers who were in what we call the back rooms or the support rooms. And this is a picture of the STS1 Ascent team. I was on this team, but I somehow missed the picture day because I'm not in the picture, but oh well. About 10% of the team were women, and only one woman was in what we call the front room in a primary position. That was Liz Cheshire, and you can see her here in the inset. I couldn't find her in the picture either, but I know she was on the team. And also Dr. Sharon Tilton, who was the flight surgeon, and they were never there for picture day. I don't know. I couldn't find any pictures of her at all anywhere. So if anybody finds a picture of her, be sure to let me know. Anyway, there were about 10% of the team were women, and I've been asked many times, what was the effect of adding women to the team? And so I'd like to illustrate the effect by telling a joke that I heard, that there were 4 engineers in a broken down car, and the mechanical engineer says, oh, I think it's the pistons have seized and we need to strip down the engine. And then the chemical engineer says, no, and I think the fuel's contaminated. We need to clear out the fuel system. And the electrical engineer says, oh, it's probably a grounding or problem or a faulty plug lead. And then those three engineers turn to the computer engineer and say, well, what do you think? And the computer engineer says, I think we should all get out of the car and get back in. And so everybody laughs because, you know, the computer, obviously, we always turn it off and turn it back on. That's what fixes it. But what the reason I think that this illustrates what happened to the teams is that each person approaches a problem with a different perspective based on their backgrounds and experience. And women have slightly different backgrounds and experience than men. And so we brought these experiences to the team to help with problem solving. And another thing that happened is we started to build trust with our male counterparts. So there's this thing called internal bias that many of us aren't even aware that we have. So when I said there were 4 engineers in a broken down car, some of you probably imagined 4 men in a car. I know I did the first time I heard that joke. And I'd worked with women engineers, but a lot of people have never had any contact with a female engineer or a minority engineer, and only 13% of engineers are women right now. So that's not surprising. So we tend to have our internal images of who an engineer is. And it takes time for us to build trust in the fact that when a woman says, hey, I think we should solve the problem this way, or I have an idea, for us to really take them seriously and trust that they have a valid opinion or suggestion. And because of this problem, a lot of women end up having to prove themselves over and over again. You know, it's common not just in space industry, but in many industries. This happens, and some women get very frustrated with this and end up leaving STEM fields because of it. But in our case, I think we rather quickly came up to speed with this problem. The men trusted us, our peers. We didn't have any trouble in that regard, at least not at first. And there was a lot less swearing in mission control. So there we were. And when we came on board and were training, we hadn't flown the space shuttle yet. So it was a brand new vehicle, and we had to write the manuals on how to operate it. And it's a very similar situation to what we have with the Artemis program now, where Orion and SLS have just been through some testing, but we haven't actually flown it with people yet. So the flight control teams assigned to that, I'm sure, are busy writing manuals and procedures, just like we did in the years prior to the first shuttle launch. And the first thing that we had to do was understand the space environment. And forgive me if I use a chart from one of my children's books, but I've discovered that the most common misconception about space is that there's no gravity in space. And I want to make sure that after you've heard this talk, that you know that there is gravity in space, and that spacecraft have to go 5 miles a second to balance that gravity's pull. So in my children's book doesn't include the equation that I put down here in the bottom, but I know some of you won't have any trouble with me putting an equation in here. So gravity is equal to a constant times the mass over the distance squared. So the distance, the radius r, is measured from the center of mass. So when you're standing on the Earth, you're 4,000 miles away from the center. And so if you square that, you get this number here. And if you build a tower, and this obviously is not to scale, but if you build a tower 200 miles high, which is about where the space station is, and you stood on it, then you would be at 4,200 miles. And if you square that, you get this number, and you compare those two, you find that you are at 0.9 G at 200 miles above the Earth. And if you stood on a bathroom scale up there and you weigh 100 pounds on the ground, you weigh 90 pounds up there. And if you step off, gravity's going to pull you right down to the surface. Of course, you'll probably burn up in the atmosphere. Don't try that, please. But if you took a running start, you would fall farther away from there because your horizontal velocity will carry you out and then down. And if you put on a backpack that could get you going that 5 miles a second, you could fall in a big circle around the Earth without hitting the ground. And so that's how we maintain our orbit. And the reason that we are weightless is because we're falling. And so, like, if you have, your trusty space duck, I always have a space duck. If you have your trusty space duck and say you stepped out of an airplane and you were both falling, you would look over at your duck and say, hey, you're floating. And you would think you were floating because it seems like you're both floating while you're falling together. And that's what's happening inside the spacecraft, is that they're all falling and they're falling together. And now if you leave the Earth's gravitational influence, you can do that by going 7 miles a second. Then you're falling in a big circle around the sun. So you can't get away from gravity, but you can be weightless because you can be falling. So once we had understood the space environment, we were ready to, and we had studied how the way the shuttle was supposed to work, we could write the books about it. Well, this is a picture of the 3 phases of the flight. We divided the books, and the teams were in the ascent, orbit, and entry, the 3 phases. And the transition between ascent and orbit is called post-insertion. And the transition between orbit and entry is called deorbit prep. So I was assigned to write the procedures for post-insertion and some for deorbit prep. And so we put those together. This is a page out of the summary timeline. It covers a 12-hour period. And you can see that we have the commander and pilot and what they're supposed to be doing. Of course, it's very heavily abbreviated. I don't expect you to understand what all that says, but I have put a red box around the post-insertion phase, which was about 3 hours. And one of the main things we had to do during that time was to open the payload bay doors. And this was really a radical concept, to have an airplane that opened at the top. I mean, it's really pretty amazing that this works so well. And then you could get your payload out, and there we go, my little Hubble telescope there. You could have the telescopes looking up at the sky or at the ground, or and so on. But what was important for operations was to get the radiator panels out and deployed, because they provided cooling for the shuttle. And if you close the doors, you had to use water for cooling, and you would spray the water on the Freon loops, and then the Freon loops would cool the water loops, which would cool the air. And so it's very important to test this. And we had, on the first flight, we were testing the doors themselves to make sure they opened right. We'd open one, close it, open, close. And we did a lot of tests there. And after the end of the 3 hours, if everything was working right, we would give them the go to stay in orbit. So one of our first things we had to do while we were preparing to launch was to identify the potential failures and then develop procedures for what we would do if they happened. So we have these things called the pocket checklist. Now, they had very large pockets on their spacesuit, because this is the ascent pocket checklist. So you can see how big this thing was. It certainly won't fit in my pocket, but they fit in the pockets of the spacesuit, so that was good. And we had we had one for each phase, an ascent, an orbit, and entry, a pocket checklist. And this was the quick thing to do. So if you had this failure, in this case, it's the loss of the cooling system, it told you what to do. Turn this thing off, go down to 1, blah, blah, blah. If go for orbit, perform these things. And if it happened during orbit and you wanted to do something in more details, you would go to the malfunction book, and which had detailed procedures of everything. So then once you had saved the system, the next thing you had to do was have a rule about whether or not it was okay to continue the flight, or if you had to abort it. And so we had, each system operator had their list of things that they had to meet in order to give the crew a go for orbit. And so, as you can see, I put it circled in green there, the flash evaporator system, which is the cooling system. If it happened we had to have both of them working in order to continue the flight. So that was the rule. If one of them broke, well, then we were coming home. So if we decided to come home because something was broken, first we would try to fix it before we would make sure that it was broken, in other words. And so we had a limited amount of time to do that. So we had to give ourselves what we called the go, no go point, so that we'd have time to prepare for the entry, close the payload bay doors, get our spacesuits back on, whatever, and be ready to go. And so we knew that we had limited communications. And so we had to put this into a timeline so that the crew could immediately jump to it and execute the procedures. And if there were changes then to the entry, because the cooling system was failed, for instance, then there were some procedures on yellow paper instead of white paper on what they should do. Like they didn't close the doors until the very last minute if they had a cooling problem. So we wrote those procedures, and then we had to go test them. And we tested them in the simulators, and we tested them in models, thermal models, and so on. And you can see here, I didn't always get a good reception on my procedures. My book manager was, do you really need all this mumbo jumbo here? Blah, blah, blah. So we went through many iterations in developing the procedures. But then once we got them approved, we would go and train on them. And this is a picture of John Young and Bob Crippen, who were the crew for the first space shuttle flight. And Crippen is saying, well, John, it's the old laws of two Freon loops. And he's saying that because you see these CRTs here, there were 3 displays, and they're all dark. And that's because the simulator had failed and crashed. Because every time we tried to turn off all the things we had to turn off for this extreme case, the simulator would crash. So, and we didn't know if we would actually be able to survive a loss of the whole cooling system, because you had so little time before the fuel cells would overheat, and you can't fly the orbiter without power. But we had something to try. And so, but I did take those procedures and I turned them into a science fiction story, because I had to, in my mind, figure out what it would be like if you had this failure. And that helped me to also to understand if I'd missed anything. Sometimes you role play these things, and I think science fiction is really a great way to do that. And I reprinted that story. It's called Fireworks in Orbit. It was my first published science fiction story, and it's in my collection called Fly Me to the Moon. And so by the time we had developed the nominal procedures, we developed the flight rules and the contingency procedures, and we trained on them and practiced, and we were ready to go. And this was the launch of the first flight. And I wanted to point out here that the external tank is white. We painted it white for the first 2 flights. And after that, we left it rusty to save the weight of the paint. And I think there's a 007 movie that has a clip of, I think it was Moonraker, and it has a clip of a shuttle launch. And you know it has to come from STS1 or 2 because it has this white tank in it. So for you trivia folks, you can be looking for that. So this was me, and I'm sorry my photo is blurred, but we didn't have digital cameras back then. I had a little pocket Instamatic, and I didn't know it was blurred until I got the film developed a week or 2 later. But anyway, it's the only one I have. And I put the timeline stacked up on some old Houston phone books underneath the TV camera, because the TV camera didn't zoom. So I had to stack it up until it came in focus. And then other people would dial in the channel on the TV to see it on the screen back here. And I would dial up their channels to monitor what they were doing in the other systems. So like if I wanted to know if they had opened the payload bay door and the switches were in the right position, I could check over here and see if the temperatures had changed. So that's how we monitored the flights. These are not computer displays. They were television screens, and everyone had TV screens, and we had some data that was directly fed to the TV cameras. So anyway, it's kind of primitive, but it worked. So the main problem we had on the first flight was that we lost some tiles. They came unglued during the launch. And when we opened the payload bay doors, a kind of hush went over the room, because what we were worried about was whether or not those tiles might be missing on the belly or on the wing. And as you all know, that is what caused the loss of the Columbia in 2003, when a piece of ice hit one of the wings and damaged the tiles. And then that wing, the plasma was able to get in and melt it. And it came off, and of course the crew was killed. But on this flight, it turned out they were not in a critical area. And but it was the job of the ECOM, who is this man here, Jack Knight. He had worked on Apollo, and as many of the flight controllers for this early shuttle program, many of them had worked on Apollo. And so he was monitoring that system. And his story is in my book, Shuttle Mission Control. And so he's still with us. He's in his 80s, and he's a really wonderful guy. And I think you'll appreciate his point of view on that particular problem. But we brought the Columbia back to what we call a flawless landing. And we all slapped each other on the back and said, gee, that wasn't so bad. We got to do it again. And so we had the second launch, and here you see the white tank again. And this was the flight with Joe Engel and Richard Truly. And during the summer, this one launched in November. During the summer, we had come up with a new way to glue the tiles, so hopefully they wouldn't fall off again. And we had some other things to work, and we also rolled in what we've learned from the first flight and to update some things in the procedures. And we had a new robotic arm to test on this flight. But it didn't go the way we thought. During the launch, the auxiliary power unit, which controls all the surfaces that move on the shuttle, overheated, and we had to shut it down. And then one of those CRTs went blank, and the inertial measurement unit, which we use to figure out where we are in space, wouldn't one of three wouldn't align, and that was something that would cause us to shorten the flight if we couldn't figure it out. But the most serious one was that we had a pH low message on the fuel cell, and we were very worried about that because you can't fly the shuttle without fuel cells, and there's 3 of them. So we knew we could get by with 2, but we didn't know, this being only the second flight, if it was a problem unique to that particular fuel cell, or if it was a generic problem with all of them, and the next one was just waiting to fail. So there was a lot of work going on, and we were all glad for our simulation training on all those disaster cases, because we just jumped right in and started working the problems. And in the meantime, the management had to deal with the press. And here's Gene Krantz, and he went with the flight directors over to, at the time it was Building 2, and this was the press room, and explained to them what was going on and that we were going to have to probably shorten the flight. And the story that Gene tells about this, which I collected from him in 1992 while it was still fresh in his mind, is also in my Shuttle Mission Control book. And I'm happy to say that Gene is working on another book. He did Failure as an Option. It's a fantastic book. And he's working on a leadership book. And he's letting me be his first reader and give him some comments and feedback. I don't know if I'm helping him or not, but I'm trying, because I really wanted to see this book, and what I've read so far, I think you all are going to be very interested in it. So he had to sell the whole plan to not just to the press, but he had to sell it to the management and Congress, because they were saying if the shuttle wasn't going to be reusable after all, and it's going to have all these problems, and we weren't going to get our space station, etc. And so there's always a lot of political drama associated with spaceflight that puts extra pressure on everyone. And Gene's main job was to keep that pressure off of us, so that we were only concerned with keeping the crew safe and meeting the mission objectives. And so, meeting the mission objectives, we wanted to get that new arm tested. So Dick Truly was putting it through its moves, and the picture came down and it was black and white. It was supposed to be color. And so we were all kind of disappointed, like, oh, it's all black and white. But we were so busy working all these other things that were going on. The crew had fallen behind in the timeline, trying while they were troubleshooting all these things. And so it was all 3 hours after these first pictures came down that we discovered why we had black and white pictures. The color camera wasn't failed at all. It just didn't have power. It needed to punch a circuit breaker in. And so that's circled there in green. And it was in my post-insertion timeline. And I was kind of embarrassed that I didn't realize this, but there was no way for me to see that monitor on that it hadn't been done, because of course we only had communications, every few minutes. Well, our flight director was Neil Hutchinson, and he just said, well, you're the best team ever, but we can't afford to be sloppy. And he said, this isn't a simulation, and the crew is counting on us to have their backs. And there's really no excuse for it taking us 3 hours to discover that we'd missed a circuit breaker. So he said, it's time for you all to take a deep breath, go back through the timeline, check everything, and see if we missed anything else. And in the meantime, we're going to try to offload the crew with whatever we can, because they need some time to finish the troubleshooting. And so the INCO was able to command the cameras on, and we got the circuit breaker punched in, and we got this gorgeous picture sent back to us. And so as I wrote it in my memoir, I'm going to read from it here, seeing the orbiter with the Earth in the background reminded us of what we were doing. We were testing a new spaceship. And it was only our second shakedown cruise, so to speak. And we were finding a few problems, including our own performance in mission control. But wow, what an amazing thing we were doing. And when hunched over our little black and white monitors and listening to all this stuff I'll talk about on the loops, we were forgetting that those voices we were hearing were two men who were in space. And I just kind of sat back for a minute with a silly smile on my face and just thought about how lucky I was to be there. So if you're feeling overwhelmed and with a million high priority things you're juggling, sometimes it's helpful to take a deep breath and sit back and say, it's worth it, because I'm making a better life for my family, for myself, for the future, for our nation. And so that's something that a good leader does. And I'm very glad that I got to work with Neil Hutchinson. And so that we shut down the fuel cell, and we had to redo the timeline overnight. The crew stayed up 20 hours, so they didn't get much sleep, but they got up in the morning, and the only way we had to get them the changes was to send them what we call a Teleprinter message. And this is from Dick Tooley saying, thanks for helping send up the morning mail. As you can see, it was quite extensive, because what we had to do was we took 5 days worth of tests that we were going to do. And this was the second test flight. And we crammed it all into one day. And right the first thing in the morning, then we had another CRT failed. So now we were down to only one in the cockpit, and we weren't sure why it had failed. And so we weren't sure if putting the spare in was the right thing to do, because that might fail too, if it was the problem was behind it. So while they were discussing what to do, Crippen went over and tried it out, and the simulator said it's going to take a couple of hours to replace it if we have to do that. And we were looking for some place to shoehorn it in, and we got this call. Hey, we have an even higher priority item. You've got to schedule time for a TV setup. We're on TV setup. Why do we need that? He said, President Reagan's here. We're like, what? See, President Reagan had wanted to come and see and talk to the crew on the first space shuttle flight, but he had been shot just weeks before, and he was in recovery, and so he couldn't come. So he was really excited about this second flight, and so he showed up in mission control, and it was just, look at him, he's like a kid in a candy store. He was so happy. I was there, and I was in the back room watching all of this, and I was just thrilled to be there. And we were all really happy for having come, even though it was super busy time for us, because having him there meant we had his support, and it showed the country that, yeah, the space shuttle's having some shakedown issues, but look what we're doing, and then this was very cool. And you see Mr. Krantz here in the background. There he is. And everyone's smiling, and the families were there, and it was good. So when they put out the newspaper the next day, troubled Columbia to return today, but we had a picture of the president, and a smiling president, and we also got a decent picture of the arm. This was, of course, in black and white, but we knew it was in color. And then it said goals were put at 90% complete. Well, then that was great, except what they didn't know was that we almost bought the farm. We paid a heavy price for that 90% complete. Because we had refused to set a priority for anything, we had crammed all that stuff into that one day, and the crew was determined to do everything that was on the list. And they did. They just did everything they could. And they stayed up another 20 hours. So they were totally exhausted. And they were also dehydrated because the fuel cell produces a byproduct of water, which we use to rehydrate their food. And there was something wrong with the spigot also. And so they didn't get much liquid, and they were exhausted. And so the common knowledge is that if Engel hadn't been such a fantastic pilot, we probably would have lost the shuttle on the second flight. But he got it down, and we were ready to go on the third flight. But between flights 2 and 3, we sat down and really went over all our procedures and everything, and said, you know, what could we have done better? And also, we were told, the flight activities group was told, you will not schedule anything during their meals, and you won't let them schedule things, keeping them up all night. And so we became protective of the crew, and to make sure that if they had to do an emergency deorbit, that they would be ready to do that. So we thought, we had 2 flights under our belts now. We're ready for anything. And then the crew got sick. So remember, we only had 2 crew members on these early flights. So you couldn't continue the timeline with somebody that was sick. And Jack Lausma had, well, he wasn't really sick. He had space adaptation syndrome. And almost 2/3 of the astronauts suffer from space adaptation syndrome, and it affects some people more than others. But if you want to know what it feels like, all you have to do is stand up and bend over and touch your toes and just stay like that for a few minutes. And if you look at yourself in the mirror, you'll see your face gets puffy, like his face is puffy there, and your temperature will rise. You'll start getting hot. And the reason that happens is because the blood has been pumped up to your head. And normally, the force of gravity is pulling it back down, right? But when you're in free fall or weightless, it's just floating along with the rest of you, and it doesn't come back down very fast. So it tends to accumulate. It's like a bathtub with too small drain. And so your brain says, ooh, too much pressure up here. I got to get rid of this. And so it raises your temperature, and you sweat to get rid of that excess fluid. And you also have an urgent need to go to the bathroom, and some people throw up, and that's the other way you get rid of liquid. And so this is what was happening with Jack. And we knew that he'd probably recover in a few days. But I experienced this on the NASA's Vomit Comet. It's also called the Weightless Wonder, but we know it's aptly named as the Vomit Comet. And that was another connection for me with National Space Society. There was a chapter at the University of Illinois, and there were some students in the chapter, and they decided that they wanted to fly an experiment on the Vomit Comet. And so the Student Opportunities Program at the time, they applied, they got accepted, and they came down to Houston to fly. And they wanted to have an article for Odd Auster magazine. And so I said, hey, I'd be happy to go with you and write that article. And so I did. And I also wrote an article for Analog, and I put those 2 together into a little ebook. It's only 99 cents if you're interested in that. But so we know that space adaptation syndrome, once the body gets rid of that excess water, you start feeling fine. And so we knew that Jack would probably be fine. But it was coming up on the end of this first full day in space, and we needed to make a decision about what we were going to do. And the next day was going to be really heavily scheduled, lots of tests that we were going to do with the arm. We had a payload that we were going to swing around out there and do a bunch of tests. And so Gene Krantz said, why don't we just swap the days? Let's the day 4, flight day 4 here, it's not as strenuous. And so we can just swap these 2 things. And so he got on the loop and told the crew that's what we're going to do. So, okay, well, and that the job of replanning and doing all the details fell to the flight activities officer, who was Carolyn Conley. And she was the first woman to be a flight activities officer. And I was her prime support person I was her timeline in the back room. And so, and there were other people in the back room as well. And the team put our heads together and said, okay, how are we going to do this? So we got inputs from all of the other console operators and from the experiments and everyone on what we were going to do. And we tried to put together this timeline. Well, it was an incredible number of changes, as you can see here. And it was too much to tell the crew to go in, well, cross this out, mark this in, add this up. You know, it was going to take them all day to do that. And so Jay Penn, who was one of our operators, said, why don't we do it like, you know, with dotted lines, because we had a very primitive teleprinter, and just have them cut it out and tape it into the book. And we thought that was great. So we did that. And the crew loved it. They said that was so much easier than trying to mark up the timeline. But as you can see, as we went through it, we ended up making changes to that too. But at least we had something to start with. And so we put that in. And that also accelerated the development of the crew activity planning system, which was an electronic way of doing that. And then eventually we were able to send those timelines up to the crew. So this was really cutting edge at the time. Of course, it was all green on white. We thought it was great that we had dual monitors. So we landed at White Sands on this flight. It was the only shuttle flight to land there. And we did that because there was a flood at Edwards. And so we landed and we got lots of kudos. Carolyn and I, you know, felt like we'd done a good job and our flight directors are happy with us. And that week they announced that Sally Ride was going to be on STS7. And I was really excited because I was supposed to be a lead FAO on that flight. I was supposed to be FAO first on flight 4 and then again on 5. And then I'd skip 6 and I'd be the lead on 7. And Carolyn was also going to be a lead on 6, and Mimi, who was over here, one of the first Asian, I think she was the first Asian woman to be a flight controller. She was going to be FAO after me on flight 5 and 6, and then she was going to be lead on 8. So we were all very excited. And then like a day later, a memo comes out and we were removed. All 3 of us were removed from our future assignments. The only thing left was our first assignment, which was for me was 4. And Carolyn was also on 4. And then Mimi got moved from 5 to 6 because she was pregnant, and they thought that she should take another flight off. And they didn't ask her, but they just decided to take her off. So we met with our Federal Women's Program Coordinator, and she said we could file a lawsuit, a discrimination lawsuit, and we decided we didn't want to do that. Or we could just meet with our managers and see if we could work it out. And that's what we tried to do, because as many of you know, women try to avoid conflict. And so we thought maybe we could just work it out. So we met with them and they said there was no intent to discriminate against us, that it was just a communication problem, etc. But our branch chief was furious with us, and we thought there might be some, he might take some revenge against us along the way. And so we made a vow, the 3 of us, not to talk about it, because we thought that would help soothe things and it would make it easier for the women who were coming up behind us. Many of them in this picture. A lot of the women in this photo, by the way, were secretarial staff or were working in document preparations and so on. But many of them went on to be flight controllers, and many of them were the people who were training the astronauts. So we were wanting to make sure that we didn't make trouble for those women coming up behind us. So we just said, well, we'll just do the best we can on the next flight, which was flight 4, and hopefully things will settle out. So this STS4, the payload was classified secret, and that gave us some communication issues for real. And so since I'm kind of running short on time here, and I can't even see a picture of Bert to know if he can't even, I can't see him. So, hey, Bert, can you nod that it's okay for me to?
Yeah, go on, Marianne. We've got a little bit more time, so we can finish up and then get into Q&A.
All right. I'll wrap it up here pretty fast. So anyway, this flight, it was a lot of fun. It was, yeah, it was also the first flight that my husband was a guidance officer. He'd been a guidance officer on flight 2, 3, 4, and 2, 3, and 4, and I was an FAO. So it was the first time that a married couple both had front room positions. So we were the first married couple in mission control. So that was pretty special for me. And the NASA photographer, Pat Petnitsky, took my picture on the console, and it ended up in the newspaper. And he told me that, well, he took my picture because I was the prettiest woman on the entry team. But actually, I was the only woman on the entry team. So we had a good laugh about that. But it was really especially nice for me because my grandmother got to see me in the paper. And I know it really meant a lot to her. And so that was someone asked in the questions, and what was one of the most special moments. And that was pretty special for me, being able to share that flight with my husband and also make my grandma proud. So yeah, there's the picture from the newspaper and my husband. Anyway, so STS-5 was the first operational flight. It's after 4, we declared it operational. Of course, there were still some issues to be resolved, and but we declared it operational, and we increased the crew from 2 to 4 because we took out the escape. We had the escape seats. You know, there were 2. They could eject, but after flight 4, we took those out. So then flight 5 had 4 crew members. So that was a little more work for the flight activities team, and we had to schedule 2 payload deployments, and that was the first time that we deployed anything from the shuttle. And my husband was very involved with the planning for that. And we were trying to do the first spacewalk, but we had to cancel it because they had some problems with the spacesuits. That was a little disappointing, but the main thing that happened on flight 5, from my point of view, was that we had a fire now in mission control, and we had planned for all these things to go wrong on the space shuttle and with the crew members and so on. We thought we'd seen it all, and with the communications issues we had with the Air Force and so on, we thought we were really well prepared, and nobody had thought about the fact that there's only one way in and out of mission control, and that was through the first floor, and that's where the fire was. So we were sitting in there with the fire smoke coming up through through the floorboards. And it was kind of complicated for me because I'd found out just days before the launch that I was expecting my first child. So it was a little bit nerve-wracking, but we got it done, and they got the fire put out, and NASA kind of downplayed the whole thing. You can read more about that in my memoir if you're interested. But we typed up this teleprinter message for the crew, and then they held it up in the window of the shuttle, and when they landed, it says, "We deliver." And so we were all very proud of our first operational flight. And then I asked, because of the incident with the fire and so on, I asked to not work on the console for the rest of my pregnancy. And I was assigned 2 flights to plan, 11 and 14. And 14 was especially fun because it had 2 incompatible payloads. There was a large format camera, which needed to look at the ground, and there was the solar array, which needed to look at the sun. So we had to do a lot of juggling with that. And I also got to work with the crew, including Judy Resnick and Charlie Walker. This is Charlie Walker here, and he later became the president of National Space Society. So I was busy working on those planning flights until June, and that's when Sally Ride flew. That's the first American woman in space. That's flight 7, and you see how they made the arm into a 7. Isn't that great? Because they had a free-flying satellite, and it looked back at the shuttle and took that picture. My husband worked that flight, and the day they landed was my last day before my maternity leave, and I had the baby on the weekend. So I had planned to come back to NASA fairly quickly, but there was some issues with my management, and you can read about them in my memoir. But I want to say that the issues that I faced with the glass ceiling and coming back from maternity leave, I think they were fairly isolated to the area that I was in, and a few individuals that were had that internal bias and some other issues, because other women I've talked to said that it wasn't like that for them, although some have admitted that they did run into some problems. But overall, NASA really did a great job integrating women into the workforce. We had courses on how to work with women, and we had women's programs and conferences. And now the center director of Johnson Space Center is a woman. She's the third woman to be the director. And there are women at all levels of the organization, although women in flight control are still a minority. There are women flight directors, and there are just women in every position. So, but I couldn't work out the childcare issues. That was really the major problem. My baby had some health issues and needed me to be with him. And so I took a part-time job with a contractor, and that's Mike Hernandez. He was my boss. He was a fantastic boss. And I really enjoyed working for them. And we were this is a room at Mission Control called the Customer Support. And we were working on the Space Lab flight with the Germans, and it was great. And then we had the Challenger accident. And of course, you all are familiar with that sad tragedy. El Onizuka and Ron McNair both were my neighbors, lived only a block away. And I knew El, his office was next door to mine. And so I passed him all the time. And Judy and I had worked on planning her first flight. And she was also from Ohio, very close. I'm from Canton and she was from Akron. And so I kind of really, I felt like she was my astronaut. But anyway, Krista McCullough was going to give the lessons, and she was going to talk about how space is for everybody, not just a few people. And that she said, that's our new frontier out there. It's everybody's business to know about space. And as we continued, I continued working for the contractor for several years, but a lot of people got laid off. And we weren't going to fly any commercial flights anymore. So the door was closing on that era, and I'm glad that the commercial era is now in full force, and I'm excited about that. But at the time, I thought maybe I could help the space program more from the outside as a writer than working inside. And so I turned to writing to spread that message about spaces for everybody. And Congress, when they passed the Space Settlements Act in 1988, when they put in the new orbiter, and they said that NASA's goal was the settlement of space. And I thought, that's what they mean, settlement of space. That means space is for everybody. So I wrote for children's magazines. I wrote for science fiction magazines. I did short stories and articles. I went to work for the Rotary National Award for Space Achievement Foundation, did their biographies, profiles. And then my first book was Space Station Science. It won the Golden Kite Award from the Children's Book Writers Society, Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. And that got me a spot on Book TV with a school visit. And then my third book, Home on the Moon, won the American Institute of Physics Science Writing Award. And getting the awards really opened up opportunities for me to go out and talk to more kids about space. So I've spoken to tens of thousands of children, and it's been wonderful. Children aren't limited in their view of the future. They think anything's possible, and it is, right? And so I love to talk to children. And I was also involved in politics because I had been somewhat constrained while I was working for the government. So I was able to go out and push for NASA's budget and make sure we got what we needed. And for that, I got the Space Pioneer Award, which I know Bert has got the Space Pioneer Award this year. And it just really makes you feel special when the people understand why it's important that you do these things. So, and I've been just blessed to be able to work with Buzz Aldrin. He wanted to do a book about Mars for children, and I had done the book about the moon with National Geographic, and so my editor said, "Hey, would you like to do a book with Buzz Aldrin?" I was like, I didn't even have to stop and think. Of course, I want to do that, and I'm very pleased that it won the Best STEM Book Award from the National Science Teachers Association. And I got to go and speak to that group and talk to more teachers about space and how to get more materials to children. And so then we did the pop-up book about the moon, but then Buzz said he didn't want to do any more children's books. And his son, Andy, kind of took that over. And through the Aldrin Family Foundation, we did Welcome to the Moon. And they're giving the Welcome to Mars and Welcome to the Moon away for free to middle schools. The science teachers write an essay about how they're going to use the books, and they give them a giant map to put in their gyms, and then they give them the books so that they can inform the kids about what it's all about, how we're going to live on the moon and Mars. So it's very exciting. I've really enjoyed doing these books, and the new book, the Shuttle Mission Control. I just want to get those stories out there and get some recognition for the hardworking folks and the flight controllers today. I'm sure they have lots of stories, and I've been thinking maybe I should talk to some of them and get their stories written down too. And maybe somebody like Emily will do that. She's been writing some wonderful blogs. So these are the things that are still available. And if you want autographed copies, you can just go on my website and you can send me an email. And there are electronic copies available. So that's it, and we can open up for questions. So how do I exit this mode here?
I'll just go to stop sharing, Marianne.
I see, stop share. All right, got it.
There, you got it, perfect.
Don't mean to interrupt, but thank you for the shout out. That was wonderful. I felt very honored. Thank you.
Well, you've been doing great work. See, I have my Space Hipsters button on.
Thank you.
And my Space Side
That's it. Perfect lead in. Well, thanks, Marianne. What a great presentation. As we were talking earlier about when to stop, there were a number of comments. No, let her go on. so I figured let's just get. It's a great story, and you kind of gave it a lead in. We have a special guest with us this evening, everybody. Emily Carney, who is writing for Ad Astra and our NSS blog, and of course, she gave a great presentation a few weeks ago for us. And we thought it would be great to have her because she also did a review for the Shuttle Mission Control. So Emily, why don't you take over and ask a few questions? And we did get some that have come in and from our audience, and we had quite a few that were submitted. So why don't I hand it over to you?
Okay, yeah, I'll start. I'll start with one of mine, and then I'm gonna just go right into the audience questions because we got quite a few of them. So, I was curious during the early shuttle years. Now, the first commercial payload specialist, like Charlie Walker, flew in space, and of course, the shuttle deployed commercial payloads. Now it's 2021. It's over about 40 years later, and now non-NASA astronauts are flying again in space. So, what lessons do you think we can take from the shuttle days as we get more into this new era of spaceflight?
You mean for the astronauts?
Yeah, or whoever, the astronauts or whoever's controlling the flight controllers.
Well, maybe we could narrow it down. Lessons in which area? I mean, obviously we've learned how to identify problems ahead of time so we can prevent them from happening. That's one of the lessons we learned, is that you need to understand your vehicle and then what can go wrong, and then what you're going to do, and be prepared to do that. And I understand the new commercial astronauts went through a lot of training, and that's probably what they were focusing on was, if this happens, here's what you do. And it has to be second nature. Like when I flew on the Vomit Comet, we went through the hyperbaric chamber where they pump out the oxygen and let you experience hypoxia, and because they said it affects each person a little bit differently. And they said you need to be able to recognize your own symptoms so that you know what to do, and you have to immediately go and put on that oxygen mask, so that it just becomes automatic habit. You don't stop and think, I wonder why my fingernails are blue, or I wonder why my nose is tingling. It's just like, oh, my fingernails are going blue, my nose is tingling, go put the oxygen mask on. And that's why you do those kinds of training. And I think being prepared for the failures of the human as well as of the equipment is important. And that's one of the lessons we learned, of course, on STS3 was we needed to be prepared, not just for the things that broke on STS2, but for the crew to have some difficulties as well. And of course, they did recover, and we ended up spending an extra day in space, so we made up for that day. We had to slow down at the beginning.
All right. This is a question from Donald Loeb. Loeb, do you appear in any films about the space shuttle, such as Space Shuttle, A Remarkable Flying Machine?
Not that I know of. I was in I had a National Geographic team come down and film me over at the Space Center for a second grade science series. But I think the only people who saw that were some kindergarten teachers. It was sold with it was a physics series for second grade. And it was called Push and Pull. What a touchy title, because we were talking about, that's the way they teach Newton's laws at that age level, is push and pull. So anyway, I guess I wasn't very good because they had to redo it like 3 times. So maybe I'm not cut out to be to TV material. But I'd be happy to be in the background on one of those shows. That'd be fun.
This isn't a question. I'm just gonna say this before we move to the next question, but this is a comment from William Higgins, and he said, "Thank you for a great talk. I had a moment of delight aboard our local bookmobile when I discovered To the Moon and Back on the shelf. I had not known you'd written a pop-up book, couldn't help but telling the librarian, hey, I know this author."
I'm glad
right.
you could find it. That book, it didn't seem to get very much attention. I guess there were just so many books out about the anniversary. I don't know. I still have some copies though, and I'm happy to autograph them. I can't get Buzz to sign them though, because he just doesn't do that. He's got arthritis in his fingers, and the last time we did a book signing, I know it was really hard for him, but he never complained. He was so easy to work with. He's really an amazing guy.
Okay, Jonathan McClellan pointed out that a lot of the shuttle checklist looks similar to Navy aircraft checklist. Is there a connection there?
Oh yes, the people who did the first checklists, I was not around at that point in time, and for Gemini and in the early program, they all came out of the military, and Gene Kranz, he actually talks about that in his new book that has not yet that he hasn't finished yet. He was talking about when he was in flight test and they used a checklist. So it was an automatic thing to do, especially the cue cards that they would stick up. We practically wallpapered the inside of the shuttle with cue cards. They were stuck on Velcro everywhere, so that the procedure was right there and you didn't have to go look it up.
All right. How good was this is from Grant Hendrickson. Grant asks, how good was the telemetry from the space shuttle, and was everything that Mission Control wanted in there, and did it have to be updated over time?
Well, we got usually well, there were, I can't remember how many ground sites there were. Any kind of technical questions like that. This book, To Orbit and Back by David Savell, I reviewed this one for NSS. It's up on the book reviews thing. It's fantastic. It tells you all the background of how they ended up with everything the way it was. But we would only be able to talk with them in very short increments, a couple of minutes at a time. And only some of the sites could handle television at a higher data rate versus other sites that could only do voice and some basic data. So so we would get little bursts of data, and then that data would come down through White Sands and through into Mission Control. And we had actually it's hard to explain. It's like if you took, do you people even know what view graphs are? I mean, it's like a clear plastic thing that we used to use, and you put type on it, and then you could see through it, and you would put it over a lighted thing, and it would shine through. Well, that's what the displays were like in Mission Control. We had these overlays, and then the data, we would overlay it, and the data would come in, and it would light up a button. And so on our consoles, you saw those rows of buttons. So like if you turned on a heater, the little button would go green and it would say that the heater was on. And if that heater failed, then it would go red and it would let you know. And so we had these overlays, and that's how we got a lot of our data. And then some data would get put into the displays, which were kind of like the overhead thing, but they were almost all TV cameras that were actually pointed at something. Like we had a strip chart recorder. That's like a pen. It's an automatic pen, and it would be writing sort of like an electrocardiogram off your heart, only it would be for a system, the temperature profile or something. And they would have a camera pointed at that, and then that would show up on your screen. So that's how we, and then, so that's how we missed that circuit breaker being not punched in, because we couldn't actually see that thing. Now the orbiter Columbia, because it was the test vehicle, it had miles and miles of wire going out to sensors that were in the wings and in every place. And that vehicle was much heavier than any of the ones that followed because of that. And they called it the DFI, the Development Flight Instrumentation. And so we had extra data on that vehicle that we didn't have on the others. So we didn't have as much insight later, but then we had more confidence in those systems. In other words, we knew what would happen. If that makes any sense. We updated our models, so then we could model it after that. Once we had the data from those test flights, we used that in our models to figure out stuff. And plus, so the guy who was in charge of the camera system knew that circuit breaker must be the reason, because he went through to figure out what could have broken, and that's how he knew. But.
Awesome. Okay, I'm gonna go to I'm probably running his last name, and I'm so sorry, Chris Leitch, Leitch, and I apologize if I ruined your name. What types of non-STEM careers do you see in the space field besides writing?
Besides writing, what do I see in this? Well, STEM is science, technology, education, and engineering and math, right? You say non-STEM. Let me get the question right. You said what are the non-STEM jobs? Public affairs certainly was one of them. And one of the funniest stories in my Shuttle Mission Control book is the public affairs officer's take on things. I love working with Jeff Carr. He was fun. Anyway, that's one of the jobs. I think that eventually, as flights become more frequent and the cost comes down, it will be like airlines. So there'll be the same kinds of jobs that there are for airlines, only for space. And those jobs are already out there, loading the cargo, doing the manifest, doing the logistics. Logistics is a huge area. Tracking all the bits and pieces and parts, and where did they go, and what's the inventory on board. For the space station, that's been a big job. So I don't know how much STEM training you need for that kind of job, but I don't think it's quite the same as level as, say, someone doing an experiment on the human body that would need to be a doctor or a PhD biologist type. So eventually we're going to need people who are construction workers if we're going to get up there with equipment. And I think that probably, like I said, space is for everybody at some point. Maybe we will actually have young people going up there, and we're going to need some educators, because they're going to be needing some training. You're going to have people doing training all the time, doing training. So, and learning other languages is another thing, because we have international crews all the time, and I think it would be very helpful to have somebody training how to speak Russian, how to speak Japanese, French, etc. I've been trying to learn Chinese for years now. Well, sure, how I speak badly, but I'm hopeful my granddaughter's going to teach me. She's 3, and she's bilingual, so she's going to teach Nana how to speak Chinese. We'll get there. but those are the kinds of jobs that come to mind. And I would like to see some artists fly in space and help document all the wonderful things up there. The photos from space, I think, are one of the biggest spin-offs, maybe the biggest spin-off in my mind, because they're so inspirational.
All right. We have a question from Jeffrey Liss. How hard how hard was it to get payload specialists such as Charlie Walker to be accepted as real astronauts? And how much do you think the nomenclature situation has changed in this commercial era of private astronauts or whatever people choose to call them?
Well, I think there was some resistance, certainly, at the beginning for people who were not NASA astronauts. But once just like when we added the women to the team, once the people had worked with them, they're like, oh, well, yeah, of course this guy's qualified. And he knows that it was called CFIS, the Continuous Flow Electrophoresis System. He knows that system inside and out. And yeah, let's take him, you know. So I think it's just a matter of familiarity. Once they have done it and used to working with that person, then they can trust them and they feel that they are adding a lot to the mission. So I never heard anybody despair of, Charlie. I never heard anybody say anything bad about Charlie. He was a great guy, and everybody just had praise for him. But I did hear that one of the German government guys, I quoted him in my book. He was very upset that we were flying politicians. He didn't have any problem with payload specialists, but he thought that we shouldn't be flying politicians like our current NASA administrator. But he just thought that there was no room for that. But if it got us funded, I didn't see any problem with it. And they trained to make sure that he wasn't going to cause any problems. And certainly we've reaped a lot of benefits from him having gone into space. And so I don't think we should start saying that, people used to make fun of Ronald Reagan becoming president because, oh, he is an actor. What kind of how did that qualify him to be president, but he turned out to be a good president. At least most historians think he was a pretty good president. So I think we should be, shouldn't be so quick to judge.
I think Larry has his hand up.
Hey,
Marianne, yeah, 30 years ago when you came to me and started the Clear Lake chapter,
40 years, maybe.
Yeah, when I asked your question, can you tell me who's responsible for the morning wake-ups on the shuttle? Those are
the Capcoms do that.
I know, but somebody started that whole thing and it just caught on. Like the morning, they play some music and they, something to wake the people up. And I says, it's some of it's pretty funny, some of it's inspirational, but somebody started that and nobody seems to know whose idea that was to put that forward.
I did read that in a book somewhere who it was that started that. But I'll have to ask Gene Kranz because he probably knows.
Okay.
But
thank you.
He's got a great memory. He's 87 now, but I think he probably knows the answer. Maybe Buzz knows. You might ask him next time you see him. I'm hoping that we can have an in-person ISDC next year, and I'm going to try and come. Maybe we'll see Buzz again.
Every time I talk to somebody, they say, "Oh yeah, I know that." And I say, "Well, who is it?" And they can't remember. They can't think of the name.
Yeah, I can't either. I'm sorry. I don't know the answer.
I think we probably have time for maybe one more question or so. Bert, what do you think?
Do you want to take a few more, Marianne? Up to you.
I'm fine. I can stay here all night. I like to.
Okay, why don't we? Yeah, let's take a few more. Absolutely.
Okay. I have a question here from Uriel Tumanen. Hello, I'm Uriel from the Philippines. I finished an astronomy degree. Astronomy is really my passion, and I love to share it with my community too as a part-time educator. I want to pursue it further, but because of the pandemic, looking for opportunities here is very difficult, and my mental health was severely affected. I think my passion was kind of lost along the way. Any advice? Would you give any advice to someone who has lost his passion because of the pandemic? And thank you so much.
Well, I really feel for you. It's been so hard not to be able to go and do the things that we've gotten used to doing. And at least the stars are still there. You can go out and look at them. And I find some comfort in doing that. I have my little telescope and I just go out in the front driveway and look. I hope you're seeing there is better than here because we've got a lot of city lights to deal with. But there's a lot of online resources, and apparently you have a computer so you can get online. And I would suggest you maybe join, there's some Facebook groups that are devoted to astronomy where you can share maybe your photos that you take and have discussions with other people who are interested in that subject, so you don't have to feel so alone. I think the worst part is that people feel so isolated, and at least we have the technology so we can reach out to each other and say, hey, you know, I'm not the only one feeling this way. So I hope you can find some people online that share your interests. Certainly members of the National Space Society share that interest in space and astronomy, and hopefully you can get on. We have a help me, Emily, what's the name of the online, the NSS group that you can go through the NSS website. I'm a member of it, but I never think about the name.
NSS Inside?
Oh, space.nss.org. You're talking about our website?
Yeah, our website, but there's a way you can chat with people there.
Oh, that's, you have to be a member inside NSS.
And
Oh,
yeah,
right.
Yes.
Okay, so if you
Yep.
join the National Space Society, then you can talk to some like-minded folks. And
We'd love
I'm on
that.
Facebook. I know other people are. If you send a friend request, I'll be happy to approve it. I can't guarantee that. I don't usually do the chats on Facebook though, just because it's a black hole that I dive into and never come out of. As you can see, I kind of like to talk about space. So, well, I thank you for dialing in from the Philippines. That's someplace I'd like to go visit someday. I hope I get down there. I haven't been able to travel because of the pandemic either, but well, hopefully we can resume our travels and we can always enjoy the stars together.
Okay, and we probably have time for one more. It's almost 10:30. So we have another one from Jonathan McClellan. One late question. What aspects of your education and background did you lean on most while working at NASA?
Actually, I think I can say I leaned most on my programming. It seems strange, but in my physics courses, I had to learn how to program. They didn't have any programming courses at the beginning of my career, but we had to learn basic. And you know, we did the old punch cards and put them in, fed them in to write programs to solve the problems in the physics labs. And then I took a commercial programming course, and then I went to work for Computer Science Corporation for 5 months and learned machine language and some other things. And I was always going back to that, and also the hands-on stuff that I had done in the electronics lab. I learned how to read circuit diagrams, and I learned how things were put together. And as a woman, I'd never taken apart a car engine or done any of those things that most boys get to do. My dad wouldn't let me anywhere near the car except put gas in it. So I didn't have that same thing. So those courses were the most important for me, because all equipment, all motors have things in common. They all have spinning parts. They use fuel and oxidizer. And so those things were important. And also just the basic physics of Newton's laws, just knowing how things work. I think was the most important for me.
Okay, Bert, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, very good. Maybe one last question, if it's okay, Marianne.
Sure,
mentioned,
it's only 9:30 for me, you know.
Oh, that's
I'm on
true.
Central Time.
But you mentioned early on about the diversity, and I know in my current position, where I try to inspire kids to STEM careers. You know, we talk a lot about diversity, and diversity means so many different things, not just gender or nationality or race. But I like the way you talked about it, about just it's about thinking differently and bringing that approach to problem solving. You know, are there, you know, in the course of the work you're doing for STEM outreach, what do you do to try to get, the underrepresented groups to maybe start thinking about engineering and STEM, because it is so important to have all those different backgrounds. And you mentioned about how few women are still engineers. So we have a lot of work to do, but I just wanted to see if you have any thoughts from your experiences doing the STEM outreach.
Well, I don't ever just try to outreach to a specific group that way. I have talked to women's groups, but the one thing that I do is I just don't talk down to anyone. I just know that people are very smart, really, and especially young people. They can learn anything and they can do anything, and just get them to realize their potential. And I've spoken at a lot of high schools that have like down in the valley. They almost all of the students were Hispanic, and I said the same thing to them that I'd say to an audience that was almost all white students. I mean, it's the same message, that space is for everybody, and you can do this. And usually the main barrier is money. And I've had them come up to me afterwards and say, I'm working 2 jobs. I'm trying to support my mom and whatever, and I just don't know how I'm going to go to college. And I said, well, there are scholarships for you. That's one thing that's different from if you're in a minority group, and for women too. There are specific scholarships set aside for them, and so but they oftentimes don't know to apply for them, and they don't know they exist. And so I'd like to try to give them those resources. Like tonight, I included the link to the intern program, the co-op programs and intern programs. They're open to everyone. So it doesn't matter. It's if you think you can do this, and you should give it a try. Don't be afraid to try, and don't be afraid to ask people for help, because if I don't know the answer, I might know somebody who knows the answer. And so ask somebody, and they might know somebody who knows somebody that will give you the answer you need. That's my advice to reaching out to that group, is to just get them in touch with the resources. But and then also to encourage them that if they fail in that first physics course, like I didn't get a C, that it's okay to go and say to the professor, what can I do differently? And there are people who will say, I think what you're missing is some hands-on activities. Let's go do it. And that might work for you. Sometimes you just need a different approach.
Very good. On that positive note, I think we'll call the night to close. So Marianne, just thank you so much for a really fun. What's that? This Larry? Did you have something?
Yeah, there's one thing that says we recently got a little bit of money from Blue Origin and dedicated to STEM research, and I think that's your input on this area. How we can spend that money to develop STEM would be something we would really appreciate. Your input on it.
I know that like with the Aldrin Family Foundation, it's a nonprofit, and they are using corporate contributions to buy copies of the book and the giant maps and give them away to the middle schools. And the middle school students are the target, I think. Most students don't really, they go back and forth about what they want to do, who they want to be, and that's when it crystallizes for them around 6th, 7th grade. And so that's why they're targeting that age group, and I think that's the right approach. And to
any input you can give us, I would appreciate it.
Well, you could buy a bunch of my books and give them away, and you can buy them directly from the publishers, or for me. I'm not trying to make money on these things. I just want to get it out there to the kids. So, you know, there are ways to do that. So.
Well, one of the things I think what we can do, Marianne, too, is we in our email exchange, you talked about maybe we do a session in the future about women in space. And we did a great session a few months ago when we had a bunch of early career professionals, all of them female, who were working in aerospace. And,
Yeah, that's great.
you know, including a SpaceX engineer, a professor, you know, a social media influencer, who's interested in astrophysics. So it was a really great session. So I think we have a lot to do and talk about that. So we'll take you up on that. And
Okay, be happy to help.
absolutely. So again, just thank you. You can see some of the chat. It was a great talk. We really appreciate you sharing your background and experiences and presenting it all in an incredibly positive approach. So it was really great, really fascinating. And I do want to thank Emily Carney for moderating and asking some great questions. So
Thank
Emily,
you.
thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Emily.
No
Yep,
problem.
you did it on short notice and we really appreciate that.
Oh, no problem. I had a great time and it was an honor to be here. Thank you.
Yep, our pleasure. So everybody, I don't want to keep us any longer. I just want to say thank you for joining us. What we will be doing is we'll be sending out the link for the recording, and we'll get, you know, our next Space Forum is going to be on the, what is it, the 7th of October or the 4th of October, Larry? I can't remember.
7th of October.
7th of October, and we've got a great presentation for you that we're going to be showcasing the India space program. So a lot more, it gives us a completely different perspective from what we're doing here in the United States. So, and that's what we want to try to do, is showcase everything that's happening in space. So look for those announcements. We hope to see you then in 2 weeks. And again, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Fred Becker, as always, for handling all of our technical aspects, and my great colleague, Larry Ahern, as we organize these town halls and space forums. So thank you all. Wishing you a really good evening for those of you in these time zones. If you're in the next time zone, wishing you a good day ahead, and also have a great weekend and stay safe. Thank you so much.
Bye.